Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin. And before we even get started today, I just want to give a shout out to the wonderful, wonderful folks who have been supporting us through Patreon. And you guys are the ones that are helping us to keep the lights on. So I want to say a big thank you to Robert Larson, Robert Vines, Joyce Goldsmith, Jonathan Cloud and Victoria Zellen Cloud, Gail Taylor, Karen Melton, Mike Cox, Irma Erickson. You guys are the best. We so appreciate it. And for everybody else who is benefiting from the programming that we're able to provide to you, we'd so appreciate it if you would also go to Patreon, that's patreon.com/sustainability now. And that'll take you to our Patreon site. Or if you go to our website or check out our emails, we have links to Patreon there too. So that's our shameless plug. And now I get to introduce today's guest. And I'm so excited to introduce you. Pilot by day and entrepreneur by night, Steve Churchill is the owner of the Urban Worm Company, a vermicomposting-related blog, online store, and manufacturer of the Urban Worm Bag. Steve is all about the worms, joyfully promoting vermicomposting as a means of turning household and commercial waste into a highly valuable soil amendment. Steve, I am so excited to talk to you today because I finally took the plunge and got myself a worm bin. And I'm really excited about worm composting and learning all about it. So it was a delight to find out about you, and I can't thank you enough for being with us today. Welcome.
Well, yeah, welcome to the world of worms. Your friends will never look at you the same again.
Yeah, I believe that. I've told a couple people I've gotten some cheers and some cockeyed looks both. So in your house, worms in your house. So yep. I think what would be a great way to start is if you can explain why in the world anybody would have worms in their home and what is vermicomposting.
Sure. Well, the reason why somebody would have worms in their home is to recycle their own organic waste. So I like to say that vermicomposting or composting are generally the most efficient forms of recycling. So if you think of the other things that you recycle in your home, whether it's paper, cardboard, glass, aluminum, all that stuff, it goes out to the curb. You've got a carbon dioxide burning truck that takes it away to a recycling place that has to expend a whole lot of energy in order to recycle it back into whatever its recycled material is going to be. In the case of something like food waste, and those other paper waste that can be used in a worm bin, that food waste is a heavy waste because of all the water content. So that is typically your heaviest waste, which means it's your highest cost CO2 wise in order to get it to where it's going to go, which is probably a landfill, which is where it's going to go and eventually emit methane gas as it starts rotting, which is far worse than carbon dioxide in terms of the heat trapping gas. So recycling food waste at home is one of the, I think, most impactful things that we can do because it's just easy. There is no energy that's expended from it. There is no heat in the case of vermicomposting that's created from it, and you end up with an awesome fertilizer called worm castings that you can use in the garden. So it's kind of a win-win-win sort of scenario that I don't think you get with other forms of recycling. Not that you shouldn't recycle, but we don't think about vermicomposting as a form of recycling, but it is, and I think it's the most efficient kind.
Beautiful.
So vermicomposting, though, is, so just to answer your second part of your question, is the consumption and decomposition of organic waste via an ecosystem of earthworms and microbes. So those microbes being normally bacteria, but bacteria and fungi that are going to, again, break that stuff down into a humus that can be used in soil, and that is a very highly effective organic fertilizer. It's very lively because of all of the microbes in it. So that's vermicomposting in a nutshell.
I have so many questions. So I
And
mean,
we got time.
let's first jump into, the aversion that so many people might have to worms.
Yeah.
I think we're kind of enculturated to think ooey gooey wormy.
Mhm.
So let's address that before we even go further.
Yeah. For some people, there was always going to be an ick factor. And the ick factor is either they just flat out don't like worms, or they associate vermicomposting with the idea of composting. Composting can often be a little bit stinky in the beginning. And so that, it's kind of a poorly named thing that you're doing, because vermicomposting is a different process than composting. It shouldn't smell if you're doing it correctly, and you should not have worms escaping out of your bin unless you're doing something wrong. It's common. It's one of those things I don't want to tell people, that no matter what, worms are not going to escape your bin. I can't tell people that, but I can tell them that if you get off to a good start, once your bin is got that rich ecosystem of the bacteria and the worms and the organic waste that's breaking down, the worms are not going to want to leave. So those are the two things. If you're doing it correctly, you shouldn't have a smell, and then you shouldn't really worry about worms escaping unless you're doing something wrong in the worm bin. And we can talk about what those things might be. But I run into people all the time, especially friends and family, that are like, oh, I'm gonna buy your bin and give it a try. And I actually tell them, don't, unless you're committed to it, because it's something that you have to come to, I think, independently. Don't do it as a favor to me. Do it with some amount of attention in the beginning. And if you get, like I said, if you get off to a good start, you almost can't screw it up from there. I consider vermicomposting like starting a fire in a sense. It's a lot more difficult to start a fire than it is to keep one going. So if you have a thriving worm bin, whether it's in your home or your garage or out in a barn or something like that, it will just keep going whether you like it or not. Really, it becomes its own sort of self-sustaining ecosystem in a sense.
That is so cool. So I have been dancing around this whole idea of having a worm bin for years. I live in a suburban setting, in an apartment, not a lot of space. And, I was hemming and hawing about it for a long time. I researched the fact that you can actually make your own worm bin, right? It's not too difficult to make your own worm bin. And there are a bunch of commercial worm bins available. Maybe you could give a quick primer on how to do your own and why to buy your urban worm bag, which is a really novel kind of contraption to be able to be having a worm farm. So it was unusual to me. I'd like you to share all of that if you would, and then we can get into how in the world you got into this and lots of other questions. So what do you think about making your own worm bin?
I actually tell people that they should, and they should give it a try. Vermicomposting attracts a minimalist sort of ethos, and I respect that. That doesn't apply to the entire market, of course. But one thing I want everybody to know is that you can vermicompost in a 5-gallon bucket. You can vermicompost in a Rubbermaid bin. You can vermicompost in a pile on your floor. It's the issue is, if once the worms have worked through that material, how do you extract the worm castings out without a very tedious process of separating the worms from the worm castings and the other undigested matter? So the way that vermicomposting worms work is they tend to stay in the top 6 to 8 inches of their habitat. These are surface dwellers. typically are not going to be found a foot below ground. In fact, out in the wild, you would not find these kinds of worms in the soil at all, which
Why
is a
is
whole different.
that?
Well, there's 3 different categories of worms. There's, believe it or not, there's 7,000 or more, maybe up to 9,000 species of earthworms in the world. Only about 5 to 7 of them are any good at vermicomposting. So they all have to be of a class called endogeic, epigeic, which means on the earth. These typically live above the soil, but below things like leaf litter on the forest floor, or in manure, those lightly packed things that are not really part of the soil. That's where vermicomposting worms work, and other epigeic worms. You've got endogeic, which would be horizontal burrowers. They're a little bit more muscular, and they would be in the layer just in the very topsoil. And then you would have anisic worms, you like those night crawlers, the big fat muscular night crawlers. They can burrow down 6 to 9 feet. They're the kind that have the spade-shaped tail. If you ever see those night crawlers, those are the kind that can go way down. So vermicomposting worms are highly specialized, or you can only a few of them, only a few of the species out there can be used for vermicomposting. So because they are surface dwellers, they tend to move up into the areas of food waste and fresher organic waste that are above them. As they do that, the layer they're leaving behind is mostly processed. It's their own poop. It's also still being processed by the bacteria and continually breaking down. So what almost all commercial worm bins, whether it's mine or the stackable bins that most people are familiar with, they assume an upward migration of those worms. In the case of the stackable worm bins, again, that I know that you have and that some of your other folks will have, what you do is you would probably take off the top few bins, and the bottom bin should be mostly worm castings, and there are your worm castings, and then you take those other 3 bins, put them down, empty out the one that you just took out, put that on top, put some fresh food waste, and then the worms keep moving their way up from tray to tray. I think those work a little bit better in theory than they do in practice. Urban worm bag, though, it really is the same principle. It is just a single compartment. There are no trays. You feed through the top, and then you can open up the bottom of the bag and then pull
Kind of a
the worm.
funnel-shaped bag.
Yeah, it's like a cone, funnel-shaped bag. You open up the bottom, and then you can pull the castings out of the bottom. So there's no lifting of trays. It's just the one downside, I would say, not to talk down my own product, is that you have to kind of get on the floor a little bit. You can't like lift trays out and then have a nice tray. You've got to kind of get below, open up that bag, empty it into something on the floor. I kind of sit into Indian style when I harvest my own bag, but that's how it works. So if you just assume upward migration of the worms into the layers of waste above them, you think they're going to be leaving their waste behind. You want to either have that tray system or have a way to access those worm castings from the bottom. So that's really 2 different ways of getting to the same end result.
So if you were going to make your own worm bin that have a kind of stacked kind of thing, you would have like plastic trays that stack, and you drill holes in them so that the worms would be able to move through it. You'd have to make sure it wasn't sharp edged, so when you cut them up as they go through, or what?
Yeah, that would be sort of the intermediate DIY. Most people actually start with just a Rubbermaid bin with holes drilled in the side for ventilation. If you were going to be a little bit more fancy with it, then you would have a lot of holes that are drilled in the bottom that you could then sort of stack and nest on top of each other for those worms to make their way up into the area above. So that would be, if somebody were to make a stackable DIY bin, that would be how they would do it. Okay. A lot of people will, at the bottom too, one of the issues, and this is something I'd like to get to later because it's one of the most common mistakes I think vermicomposters make, is they run their bins way too wet. And so you often want to have a way, which my bin doesn't, because I try to educate my customers, look, don't run your bin this wet, but to allow the leachate that comes out, basically that liquid that comes out of the bottom of a worm bin, you want a way to get rid of that leachate. A lot of people call it worm tea. It's not worm tea. It's not worm tea. It's just the excess moisture that is released from food waste as it breaks down. So there is a whole lot of water that's bound up in our food waste. Most fruit and vegetable waste is 85 to 90% water. You only want about 70% of moisture content in your worm bin. So if people feed their bin food waste, and then especially if they feed their bin food waste without feeding absorbent, drier material like paper or cardboard waste to kind of help absorb that moisture, then what happens is that food waste breaks down over time and its stuff starts just leaching to the bottom. It's not some liquid that's created by the worms. It's just mystery juice that makes its way to the bottom of the bin.
Is that mystery juice good if filled with nutrients? Would it be good for plants, or is it not so good?
If it were filled with nutrients, yes. It could also be filled with pathogens because if it becomes anaerobic. Here's the thing: I can't tell you it's bad. Some people say they have great results with it. If you don't know, then don't use it, especially on edibles. Edible plants. Maybe use it on ornamentals or something, house plants, something like that. But I would not be using that liquid on anything that you plan to eat.
Okay, so the worm bin that I have, which is plastic, it's recycled plastic, which is really cool, and it's cute and little. Which is one of the urban worm bag looked like it's pretty sizable. I don't know.
Yes.
I didn't measure the dimensions. Anyway, it does have, and a lot of these composting bins that you can purchase do have a place for the liquid to come to drain. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that if you do it right, you're not going to have that liquid. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And so I want to get to the balance of how to do that and how to take care of the worms and all, but I want to understand what makes a worm a worm. You said there are all these different kinds of worms. So what makes a worm a worm?
That's a good question. I'm not a biologist, but I know that most worms are in the of course, the kingdom phylum class. I don't know exactly what it is, but annelida, annelids are earthworms are, as I am presuming anyway, mostly annelids. I mean, they're going to, of course, have no bones. They're going to, they reproduce by way of their worms are hermaphroditic. Actually, I don't know if you knew that. They reproduce, any worm of the same species can reproduce with another adult worm of that species. They are, it's a single, digestive channel from end to end. That's a great question. What makes a worm? But it's one of those things we know it when we see it.
Okay. Well, I think I know growing up, there used to be night crawlers all over the place. And when it rained, there were these big worms all over the pavement and the drive. I haven't seen them in years, which is not a good thing. But they were these massively big worms, and we used to call them night crawlers. And when I started looking for worms for my compost bin, I saw that there are the red wigglers, and then there are blue somethings and night crawlers also. There are all these different breeds of worms that do different things, and some of the packages that I saw available were mixed species. And so I'm curious about that and what the benefits are for the combinations and how that works with vermicomposting.
I think that the worms, when it comes down to it, really do very similar things. Whether you're talking about the red wiggler, you talked about the Indian blue, which is often confused with the red wiggler. The Indian blue is often sold as the red wiggler. They function almost exactly the same, so most people don't care. You've got the bigger cousin of the red wiggler, which is the European night crawler, which isn't really a night crawler. You've got African night crawlers, which are much bigger, but they're larger, but they're still composting worms. Those are the four main types let's see, I talked about four main types that we would find here in the United States, commercially available. They really do the same thing. It's just what kind of environments do they like? Really, what temperatures is it that they like? So I like the red wiggler because it has the widest range of of temperatures that it prefers. It's basically 55 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the vermicompost. And European night crawlers like something that's a little on the cooler end, and Indian blues and African night crawlers like something on the warmer end. But the range of the red wiggler kind of encompasses them all. So I just sort of tell people, go red wiggler. If you're not sure, just go red wiggler.
Okay,
So
so now you said that these worms wouldn't be found in the wild.
they would not be found if you went digging in your soil, unless your soil, especially the kind of soil, and you and I live 15 minutes away from each other. Here in Pennsylvania is kind of has a lot of clay, some rock. It's not loose enough soil that you would find red wigglers in your soil. You might find them. You might find them in manure piles. That would be one place that they seem to congregate, but they are not muscular enough to dig their way into our soils. If you had if you inoculated a garden, a raised bed with red wigglers, and you kept the soil very airy and allowed them to move without much of a hassle, then you might be able to sort of culture them in the wild in your garden. But these exist in the wild, but they don't exist where people think that they do. And so the kind of worms that you would find on the sidewalk after a big rain, those are not going to be composting worms. Almost always, I just about guarantee they would not be composting worms.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So what if, let's say I've got my worm bin, I'm waiting for my worms.
Mm-hmm.
And also I'm wondering if you can point us to resources. So I know on your Urban Worm Company website, and it is urbanwormcompany.com, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That you have a link to buying worms from, is it what's the company?
Mimi's Worm. So basically, if you go to urbanwormcompany.com and then you go to my shop page, you'll see different choices of worms. And for the red wigglers, European night crawlers, and the compost mix, which is several of those mixed together, that would take you over to Mimi's Worms. It would actually take you to a special page over on Mimi's Worms that allows you to buy at a small discount to other folks. Thank you for doing that. So that is how you could buy through me. You could of course go straight to Mimi's Worms. That's MEMES worms.com. But you can get a little bit of a discount if you go through my site. But that is how that would be one place where you would buy the worms. As far as resources where people can learn, I really have worked very hard over the last few years to create blog content on my site at urbanwormcompany.com, and also my YouTube channel, where I kind of cover typically some bite-sized topics for people, 5-minute long videos. I'm not going to make you sit through a couple hours of me blabbing on, but those are good resources, I think, for beginners. And I would love to have people, people stop by. One good book that is kind of the seminal book that started this was in the 1970s by a lady named Mary Applehoff. It's called Worms Eat My Garbage. And it really popularized vermicomposting, 40 some years ago now. And that is another really, really good resource that you can go look at. Sure.
We're going to make sure that when we post this interview on our website, we'll post a link to you, your shop, and the book, and all the other good resources that we talk about. And that'll be on sustainabilitynow.global rather than .com. So
okay.
I really do have so many questions, but I want to start. We talked about making a worm bin. We talked about commercial worm bins that are out there, and the urban worm bag. I do want to talk about that because it is fabric, and you talked about it not being stinky. And I just want you to be able to say a little bit more about that, like how this fabric thing, like we can understand that maybe a plastic thing would contain odors and all of that. You said if we do it right, it doesn't smell, but what's the advantage of the worm bag?
So the worm bag is fabric, but it is also lined with a very thin polyurethane liner, which allows some amount of respiration, but is not going to just is not as porous as you might have with regular fabric. So if you think of backpack fabric, like that Cordura nylon fabric, that's what the urban worm bag is made out of. Again, with that kind of very thin polyurethane liner on the inside. Understand though that a worm bin is never going to be airtight. It should never be airtight. So if there is something stinky inside, it doesn't matter if you're using a plastic stackable worm bin or the urban worm bag. If it stinks inside, it's going to start stinking outside. And the way that you prevent that is you make sure that you add a lot of a carbon-rich material with your food waste. So carbon-rich material would be paper waste, cardboard waste, dead leaves. You could add peat moss, cocoa coir. There's, of course, sustainability issues around, especially peat moss, but something that is a carbon-rich material that can kind of deaden that mixture with the food waste. So what I recommend is 2 parts by volume, 2 parts bedding to 1 part of food waste. That bedding is going to not have the mass of the food waste though, right? You're going to have a really kind of big amount of very light carbon material to mix with a very dense, water-laden, dense food waste. You mix it all together. Some people use a lasagna method where they'll, put a layer of food waste and then cover it with a layer of. I kind of like just say, look, just the worms are gonna mix it up for you anyway. But go ahead and mix all that stuff up. What you're preventing is the fermentation that would happen if your food waste were just left in a clump to just sort of start rotting. You're trying to actually make it an environment where the bacteria can efficiently process that material without it really getting into that nasty, stinky, fermenting state where you not only have bad smells, but you attract fruit flies. So that is how you do it. And that's a thing that most people actually get wrong. They get a new worm bin that doesn't have that established ecosystem. They read on the internet that you can feed 50 to 100% of your worm's weight in food waste every day. They put it in there blindly. They don't think about it, and they wake up a week later and they've got a mess on their hands. That's because they are being too aggressive with the feeding regimen, but then also not feeding the carbon-rich food waste that you really need to in order to have that. I call it a deadened mix. You don't want that potent mix of food waste. You can make it a much more benign environment with a lot of that carbon-rich waste to go along with it, and it's going to absorb that moisture, which is again what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent that moisture from just draining out of that food waste and then making its way to the bottom of the bin.
Okay, so I read a couple things. I read one thing that said don't distribute the food all across the whole bin. Have it create little areas of it and then migrate that as you're putting in new waste. Is that advisable?
I think it's doable. I think the reason why you would do that is by not covering the entirety of the surface of your worm bin, you're allowing the worms to escape somewhere. Let's just say you mess it up. It's a little bit of an insurance policy if you do what's called pocket feeding, like you were talking about, just put some in the corner and then put some over here in the corner. The thing is, if you put that clump over there in the corner and it's just food waste, then you're going to be in the same position that I was saying you should avoid, which is where you just got this clump of food waste that is going to start stinking. Okay. So that's why I say, if you can just take this stuff and just add that bedding with the food waste, then you don't need that insurance policy of doing the pocket feeding around your bin. But okay. These things can't hurt. I don't like to set rules. I like to, here's my guidance. Sure. You can deviate from it.
So if we're using cardboard and we're using newspaper, for instance, I also had read that you should moisten it. And it sounds to me like maybe we don't want to moisten it.
You want to moisten it in the beginning for sure. So you are trying to get that 70% moisture content level. And 70%, just so people know, is if you pick up a material and you squeeze it in your hand as hard as possible, if you get 1 to 2 drops of water out of there, then you're right around 70%. If you get none, of course you're less. If you get a lot more, then when you start a worm bin, you're going to want a moist environment, because you're not starting a worm bin. And this will be good advice for you, because you've got your bin now, but not your worms, is you want to start with that carbon rich layer, whether it's food waste, paper waste, not food waste, but paper waste, cardboard waste. You want it moist, but not wet. And then what you want to do is add a little bit of organic waste, like food waste in there, maybe an apple core, banana peel, stuff like that, that is going to provide a food source for the bacteria to start breaking things down. You actually want the bacteria to start blooming before the worms ever get there, because the worms hate a sterile environment.
Oh.
And so the bin, when you got it, is a sterile environment. If all you did was take paper waste that you just sprayed down worms and put it into a nice new plastic bin, that's a sterile environment, really, and the worms are not going to be happy. Okay. So the stuff you can do in the beginning to get that bedding ready before your bin ever gets here is going to pay, it's going to pay dividends for you.
Beautiful. So let's talk about specifics of that. Do I want to be shredding the cardboard? Do I want to be shredding the paper? I want to put a little bit of food waste in there so that it gets bacteria.
Yes, I say shredded paper, shredded cardboard. You might take a little bit of a handful of soil, like garden soil, mix it in there. Worms need grit, actually, in order to digest their food. They will ingest the grit, and it's the muscles inside the worm that actually move that grit around, which breaks the food waste and fragments the food waste. So yes, that carbon rich paper, cardboard, a little bit of soil, perhaps just a little bit of soil, mix that up, a little bit of, I would say no more than, I would literally say a half a measuring cup of food waste to put in there, and make sure that it has that approximately 70% moisture content, and let it sit there. And the longer you let it sit there before you introduce the worms to it, it's probably the better. So
that's great.
Yeah, too many people, I would say it's a very common mistake for people to order their worms with their worm bin at the same time. And so there's a lot of things that can happen. One, you could have the Postal Service or FedEx or UPS mishandle the worm bin. This happens to me. People show up, they've got parts of their frame that are missing, but they got their worms now. You want to make sure that you get your bin set up before the worms ever arrive. Okay. Preferably at least a week.
Wow. Okay. So I'm glad to be talking to you today, because I don't think I have a week before I get the worms. So
it'll be about a week before yours get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And so, wow. As far as feeding the worm bin, I saw on websites that there's worm food to feed the worm bin. And so is that only if you don't have food waste to feed them, or?
That should not be necessary. One thing in a vermicomposting environment, understand that when you buy your worms and they first arrive, they have come out of a vermiculture environment. So vermiculture would be the breeding and the growing of the worms, and it's in the worm seller's best interest to sell you the biggest, fattest worms that they can, because they typically sell by the pound. So when you get a pound of fat worms, you're actually getting fewer worms than if you had a smaller amount. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but what I'm saying is that worms that you get now, when they go into a vermicomposting environment, are generally not going to be fed some of those protein-rich foods that are going to keep them sort of fatter and chubbier like they were in a vermiculture environment. So you can expect a little bit of shrinkage in a sense, and the worms will just get skinnier. It doesn't mean that they're not healthy. It just means they're smaller. So the chow, though, is for the folks who, I really like to fatten up my worms, or I'd like to go fishing with my worms. So I'm going to take this stuff and sprinkle it over the top. And it's funny what a little bit can do, because a little bit of worm chow can fatten up the worms considerably. I think it's all the protein that's in there. But it's not, if you have enough organic waste, and most households do, you shouldn't need to do that, because the worms are not unlikely to out eat your ability to produce waste, if that makes sense.
Okay. And the
Yeah.
other thing I had read is, and I didn't, you're the first person or the first source of information that I've heard about preparing the bedding and everything ahead of time. But I had read, when you get the worms, don't feed them for a week, so they get real hungry. And I don't know, does that make any sense? If you prepared the bed, do you need to do that?
I don't think that you are doing them any favors by trying to start out by starving them. Now, understand that it takes forever to starve worms, but if you've put them into an environment where they've got organic matter, they're gonna eat and they're gonna survive.
Okay.
It takes a long time to starve worms. If you can go on vacation for a month, not feed the worm bin, they might be languishing a little bit when you get back, but you're gonna be fine. I would not worry about getting too cute with guidance like that.
Okay.
I know, again, a respected friend of mine said, worms didn't read the book, and they don't read the book that you read. They aren't always going to behave the way that you think that they will. And so I can't endorse the idea of not feeding for a week. What I can endorse is being very conservative with the amount of food that you give them in the beginning, because you are not going to have a thriving, I keep coming back to ecosystem. You're not going to have that thriving ecosystem, that community of bacteria that you are going to have later. You're also not going to have as high a worm population as you're ultimately going to have. So you may have gotten a pound of worms from Mimi's.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say it was like $45. It was shocking to me to see.
Yep.
Worms are really
they're not.
expensive.
Yeah, they are expensive, and of course that price included shipping. But yeah, they're expensive, and that's another reason why I tell people to take it easy in the beginning. Like, if I don't want you to make a costly mistake by overfeeding your bin, making a nasty environment where the worms want to escape, and now you've got to buy another pound of worms. The bin that you got is likely to eventually hold about 2.5 pounds. So that means, later when your worm population and your bacteria population are much higher, you're going to be able to feed that worm bin more later than you are now. So don't look at the future and apply that to now when it comes to your feeding schedule. So just be very cautious. I don't even like giving people guidance like just do a measuring cup every day. No, you might just want to do a measuring cup every week and let your eyes and your nose tell you if something is going wrong. If it starts smelling bad, then you've overdone it with the food waste.
And how do you correct that? Just by adding more bedding?
More bedding. I would just say add more bedding and then stop feeding. And that'll kind of level itself out.
Okay, very cool. Yeah. So I think we covered a lot of the how-tos for actual practice, and I wanted to talk about you're a pilot. So how in the world did you get hooked in with vermiculture and vermicomposting?
Yeah, it was really, I don't want to say it's a strange story. It really has nothing, of course, to do with being a pilot. But we moved into suburban Philadelphia. We're lucky enough to have an acre. We have a barn here on our property, and we had some space. And my wife said, I want to do a compost pile. And I said, okay. Well, one of the big frustrations with people doing composting is that they can't really get the compost pile to heat up the way that they want it to. And so I said, okay, I've read I need more nitrogen. And so I went to Wawa, which is a convenience store chain around here that has like 19 different kinds of coffees. And I was able to bring home like 150 pounds of coffee grounds, put them into this compost pile that I had, wet it down, do all the right stuff. I turned the pile, and I came back a few days later and it was blazing hot. I was just fascinated by a natural process that, of course, I'm putting my wife's meat thermometer in the compost pile, which she wasn't thrilled with. But I was reading 155 degrees. I could not put my hand in the pile for more than a few seconds, and I had to pull it out. And I was just fascinated. What happened though is, as that pile cooled, later in the summer, these worms moved in from basically from the kind of the wooded area around my compost pile, and it started further processing this material and turned it back into what looked like coffee grounds, but they weren't coffee grounds. It was just this really fine material. It was beautiful. And my wife goes, "Oh, that's worm castings." So fast forward, I start reading about vermicomposting. And with the exception of a few different websites, I really didn't like the kind of information I was finding online. It wasn't speaking to me. And I've kind of always, even though I've been gainfully employed, but I've always had kind of an entrepreneurial itch to me. I said, I'm going to start a website here. And let me just see if I can write about vermicomposting and see if I can drive traffic to a website and teach people and kind of teach them how a beginner will be learning. And I just kept doing it and it never stopped. I'll be honest with you, Mara, this was not supposed to be the idea that was going to, bring me, fame and riches. Of course, it still really won't be, but, but it was something that I was like, I just kept doing it. And, the audience kept growing and I just didn't quit. And eventually, started launching these other products that I felt like the market needed. And so that's really how I got started. One nice thing about being a pilot, though, is since a lot of my work is done online, it's done with like writing and blogging and stuff like that. I can do that in a hotel room. And so I have time that's to myself that, the phone's not necessarily ringing. My wife hates me for it sometimes because I just do whatever I want when I'm on the road because I'm in a hotel room for, maybe 18 hours at a time. And, but it allows me the time to be productive with writing, content for the website. And that's kind of been the good part about being a pilot while doing this. Otherwise, there is almost no overlap. In fact, I like to joke that vermicomposting is my penance for burning fossil fuel for a living. So I said, this is maybe just the way of the universe evening the score.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
we were talking before we had this interview, and you told me that there is a worm business conference. So that launched a conversation about what in the world would be at a worm business conference. And you said that worms are big business now. I'd like you to talk a bit about that, if you would.
Sure. So let me talk about the original worm conference, which has not gone on for the last few years because of COVID. And this is how a lot of us in the community know each other. It was hosted, the original, let's start from the beginning. The original worm conference started what would have been about 22 years ago now on the campus of North Carolina State University. There's an extension specialist there named Rhonda Sherman who organizes this. She brings in academics and business people, and they talk about what they know. And believe me, it's a lot more of an evolving industry than you might think, especially on the research side as we learn more about soils and microbes and plant growth hormones. And it's really incredible, the body of research that's happening. And so that was a place where a lot of us were able to kind of meet each other, network. It's just otherwise a very fragmented, decentralized kind of industry. That unfortunately has not been able to go on the last few years because of restrictions on COVID. But Zach Brooks of the Arizona Worm Farm, as part of our community, said, I would like to have a conference here, but it will be more of a hands-on conference where people can actually understand how we do worm breeding, how we do composting, vermicomposting. They have a garden there where they use their material, they use their products and how they've grown this thriving business out in Phoenix. And so I am much more on the marketing end of things. I'm not necessarily one of the scientific experts, and I'm not necessarily a worm breeder myself. But I feel like I have some, and the community thankfully feels that I have something to offer in terms of helping people build business. And so I will be presenting out there next week at the only worm conference I think that you're going to find in America this year. Only 50 attendees. They're normally about 150 for the other one, but they're keeping it small. And so the things that you would talk about are worm breeding techniques, which I talked about worms creating cocoons, and they will create cocoons in different environments. They will create cocoons in a vermicomposting environment in your worm bin. Those worms are going to reproduce, but there are ways that you can manage the conditions in such a way with food and with moisture where they will reproduce even faster. And so you learn those techniques.
Tell us about worms creating cocoons, because I did not know that worms do that.
Well, this is where I get out of my league a little bit. Worms that, yeah. So, okay, we're creating cocoons. This is a, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. So 2 worms of the same species, 2 adult worms. And the way that you would identify an adult worm is it has the clitellum, which is that fleshy band that goes around a worm. Baby worms and juveniles don't have that, but when they reach sexual maturity, they have that fleshy band called a clitellum. The 2 worms will go basically head to head, and they will wrap themselves around each other. And it actually looks like a single deformed worm, but it's actually 2 worms that are just coiled around each other. They are both releasing, and this is where I'm going to be speaking out of my league a little bit, is they will release kind of a sperm into this shared area, which eventually forms this cocoon. And then as the worms sort of separate from each other, it leaves this kind of mucus, this harder shelled mucus area that's got what is normally going to be 3 to 5 baby worms in this cocoon, which is looks like a lemon seed kind of shaped, or lemon shaped seed with kind of like a tapered end. After about 3 weeks, that cocoon is going to hatch, and those 3 to 5 baby worms are going to come out. And I believe it's about 42 days later, those worms will reach sexual maturity and then can begin. So in the right environment, you can get a whole lot of, if 2 worms are going to make 5 worms every 21 days, then you can see how the exponential growth of a population can happen if you're managing the conditions correctly. Worms are excellent self-regulators, so they will not continue to reproduce with each other if the conditions are not correct, if the conditions are not such that supports a greater population. So if you're not feeding them enough, they'll stop reproducing. If there are too many worms in there, they will sense that and they will stop reproducing, or they will just reproduce much more slowly. So they're very simple creatures, but a little smarter than we give them credit for. So those are the kinds of things where you kind of, a conference like this gets down into the, like, here is how we were able to, boost our reproduction by 50% using these techniques. And that conferences like that are a great place to share that kind of information.
And so that's one of the aspects of business with worms, but there are other aspects too. You said because of the rise of hemp production, that demand for the soil amendments that are created through worms has also risen. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit too.
Yeah, so there was the big organic boom where people were wanting to get away from synthetic fertilizers. So that by itself was sort of this much more broad kind of created this broader demand for organic soil amendments like worm castings. And worm castings are worm poop. It's just, let's just say it, call them what they are. If you layer on top of the organic movement, you've got the cannabis industry, you've got the hemp industry in the states, of course, where those crops are legal. Then there is an incredible demand for worm castings. And so depending on, it's very regional in terms of the market. In some places where they're using a lot of it, in California, the price may be a little bit higher, but it's also, there are a lot more producers out there. So it's definitely a growing industry, and it's caught a fair amount of people's attention in terms of the business opportunities around it, which is a good and a bad thing. So it's not the best thing for a small vermicomposter to have some really large scale operations come down, because it obviously brings the price that they can get down if they are competing on price. And so again, from a business aspect, one thing that you have to, if you're in the business of selling worm castings, is what makes your worm castings better than the stuff you can get at Home Depot off the shelf for what amounts to very small. And a lot of times you have to make the case with, here's the biology in it, here's the testing that I just had done on my batch 3 weeks ago. Like, this is really good stuff. So that's I'm going farther than what you wanted me to,
I'm
but
fascinated.
it's more complex. It's more complex than people give it credit for.
I imagine the thing that would make one homegrown batch better than what you would get at Home Depot is that it would have a higher bacterial content, as well as microbial content, whatever.
It should, because the before those bags would ever get to market at Home Depot, they're going to probably sit in several different warehouses before they sit in Home Depot, which is itself a warehouse if you think of it. So and they're going to sit in plastic bags, which may or may not be perforated to allow air in. So you may be buying worm castings, but there may be no biology available in those worm castings. You know, one thing with the microbes is they can go dormant and they can kind of keep themselves in a sort of a frozen state, if you will, where they're not active and they can come back to life. But if that bag has sat oxygen free, and possibly if it were ever sat out in the sun, you know, UV light is a big killer of the biology. You just don't know. And so the thing I can't tell you is, oh yes, fresh worm castings are going to be better than these worm castings. Like, you just don't know unless you can put them under a microscope and know what you're looking for. But in general, if somebody wants fresher worm castings, getting them at the farmer's market is going to be a better way than getting them at, you know, at a big box store.
Okay, so let's say I have houseplants. I've got my worm bin. I'm getting homegrown worm castings. So what do? I put it on the top of the soil in my plants, or I put water with it and use the liquid and filter out the worm castings? What's the best thing to do?
All the above.
Okay,
so you can.
That's how you make worm tea, right? Real worm tea.
That would be how you would make, in this case, an extract, where you are taking that stuff and steeping it in water, and you can take that liquid and then pour it on your plants. The other thing people can do is, and I'm skipping to the end before I'm going to get back to the simple stuff, but they can make actual worm tea, actively aerated worm tea, by taking this is a little bit more involved, but you take a little bit of worm castings, you put it into a bag, like a very tightly meshed bag, suspend it in water, add a food source like kelp meal, alfalfa meal. You could use molasses, although molasses produces a giant boom in microbes before it creates a crash in microbes. It's kind of like a sugar high in a sense, but you aerate that water with a bubbler, or otherwise agitate it with something that can do it for 36 hours or so, and then you are left with an extremely vibrant microbe population that you then use, and you need to use immediately, because that microbe population needs a place to live, because after a while the water will just become it won't become as oxygen rich as it was before, and so you need to use that. But that is a very economical way to take a very little amount of worm castings and treat a very large amount of you know, relative to the amount of worm castings. It's just a very economical way to use them. If you are just using worm castings, and you can either top dress or side dress, I can't tell you how much to use on each plant. If for larger plants, you might use 1 measuring cup. For smaller house plants, it might be just a teaspoon. The other thing you can do is, if you are creating your own soil, creating your own potting mix, you want to mix it in at about a 10%, 20% max substitution rate. More than that can actually give you negative results in your growing. More is not necessarily better with worm casting. So all the other things that you might be making when you're making your soil, whether it's, you know, peat or cocoa or compost, you know, all the, you know, the third mix, you want to add a little bit of worm castings in there. But otherwise there's not you know, there are no hard and fast rules about what works the best. What I will say though is that different plants, depending on where they are in the plant progression, want different kinds of soil. So if you have trees and shrubs that are higher on the plant progression, think of redwoods, those are the big daddies at the top, those would want a more fungal vermicompost, which is different than what most vermicomposts are, which is more bacterial. So your fruiting, your garden plants are going to tend to want things that are more bacterial, whereas your trees and shrubs would want things that are more fungal. So that's just another layer of the onion that can be peeled off to say, how do you make that happen? And we can go there if you want, but
I'm really curious, how do you make that happen?
Well, fungi thrive in areas where there's a lot of carbon, a lot of cellulose. So if you think of things where there's wood chips, very woody mix, municipal waste, I don't say municipal waste, but as long as it has a lot of wood and that cellulose, those are environments where fungi thrive. And so most vermicomposts are not made with that woody material. If you're talking about paper and cardboard with food waste, that is almost guaranteed to be a more bacterial vermicompost, especially in the beginning. So bacteria are easier to grow than the fungi. So that would be my main thing, is you want a woodier mixture for a more fungal vermicompost.
It's amazing how many nuances there are to this. It really is a science.
The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And so
isn't that the case about nature all around, right?
Yeah.
So I want to say thank you. This has been amazing. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
Oh goodness, no. I would tell people, I like I said before, if it's something that you want to try, commit to it for a while. Let go, don't just go, I want to try this. You're going to have to pay more attention to your worm bin in the beginning than you will 3 months later.
So what's a while?
I'm sorry?
What's a while?
I would say 2 months into it, your worm bin is going to be rocking and rolling. And if it's just not something that fits your lifestyle, don't try to make it fit your lifestyle. Your roommates and spouses will not be thrilled if you do mess it up and you do have worms that escape your bin. But it's an addicting thing once you get it right, because you get fascinated by how well the worms will respond when you are doing things right, how quickly they will attack your food waste. There's nothing more fun than to watch them attack a pumpkin. And I wouldn't try a whole pumpkin. You talk about getting a mess on your hands, try putting a whole pumpkin in your worm bin. But they love pumpkin, they love cantaloupe, and it's just fun to put that stuff in there and come back and watch them having swarmed it just a few days later. There's something addicting about it once you get going. That's for sure.
That's so cool. And it occurred to me, I should ask, are there things that we shouldn't put in the worm bin?
Very good. That's a very good question. So worms will ultimately, here's a blanket statement. Worms will ultimately eat any organic matter, eventually. But if you want the safer organic matter, I would stick with fruit and vegetable waste, no meat, no dairy. Within that fruit and vegetable, I would stay away from things that are aromatic, like onions, garlic. You can do a small amount of citrus peels, but things that have a really vibrant smell to them, I would stay away from. If you've got no other choice and go, well, I just have a lot of garlic and nothing else, which that would be an odd odd feeding regimen. I would definitely stick with those more common types of food waste: banana peels, apple cores, coffee grounds. Most of us have enough we're eating enough stuff at home, cuttings from, food prep from, broccoli stalks and cauliflower and stuff like that. Those are things that are very, very safe to put in a worm bin that are not going to cause you trouble. The other stuff, you can do it. It just adds a bit more risk, to the equation.
Should we chop it up into small pieces, or?
Chopping up, yes. I like that idea. It increases the surface area that the bacteria can attach themselves to, and so it begins to break that material down. And the point I want to make, I know I've talked about bacteria a lot, but bacteria prepare the food waste to be eaten by the worms, and the worms eat the bacteria and the food waste at that point. And then they poop out this really bacterial rich stuff that actually further accelerates the decomposition in the worm bin. So the worm castings themselves actually help the decomposition of the other, undigested matter that's in the worm bin.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm forgetting what your original question was, but
what not to put in the bin?
What not to put in the bin? Yeah, I would just stick with those non-aromatic fruit and vegetable waste materials.
Like an avocado seed. Can you put that in there? An avocado?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is it will not break down. Just won't. An avocado pit will not break down from top to bottom in something like an urban worm bag. It won't hurt anything, but it would not be something where you would yield any worm castings out of an avocado pit. Even an avocado peel may not break down that well, but it doesn't hurt to put it in. It's just going to be stuff that doesn't get broken down that well, but it's not harmful at all.
Okay, and how deep should you make the bedding before, to put the worms in initially?
I like about 6 to 8 inches.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you mentioned a couple resources. You mentioned your website, and I'll give you an opportunity to do that again. And the book that you mentioned, are there any other resources that we should be checking out?
There's a lot of great YouTube videos out there. My buddy Bentley Christie is up in Canada, runs what I consider kind of the original composting blog at redwormcomposting.com. Those are some resources I think that are good. You're going to see a lot. I don't want to tell you definitely don't believe everything you read on the internet. One of the things you're going to read on the internet is that worms can eat 50 to 100% of their weight every day. They don't do that. It's probably closer to 25% in good conditions. So stay away from things that make those declarative statements. Take everything, even stuff I say, with a grain of salt, because I may have written something 5 years ago that I now no longer believe to be true. So I would say, aggregate your information from a variety of sources, but I think that I'm really proud of my most recent articles that I put out, specifically the Ultimate Guide to Vermicomposting, which you can find on the homepage of my website.
Awesome.
So that would be where I would, first place, that's the first stop.
That's where I'm going right after we're done here. Thank you.
Okay.
So I just want to say thank you to you. This is great. I'm so excited. And thank you to everyone who is part of our community, who watches and shares and is holding the torch for creating a world that works. I want to say thank you to my partner in Sustainability Now, Scott Billy, and our producer. And you can check out our website at sustainabilitynow.global. And that's it for today. Until next time, live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Visit sustainabilitynow.global for resources related to today's program. And be sure to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.